Everybody, good evening. Wow, this is on high. We'll wait till you start speaking for him to adjust it, but it's like loud, right? It's okay? Okay. Welcome, I'm David Kramer. I'm the Joseph J. and Dora Bell Librarian until the end of June here at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it is a pleasure once again to be able to hold an opening event like this. It's actually a coming home experience because in the fall we didn't have an exhibition here on site. That some of you may have had the opportunity to visit our fabulous exhibition at the Grolier Club, where we had an opportunity to show a great many of our great treasures. Now we're in somewhat smaller quarters, but this provides us the opportunity once again to focus on an interesting and inevitably central question about Jewish identity, and that is, as you already know, conversion to Judaism. Your people shall be my people. A couple of words of introduction, both of the topic and of our speaker tonight. And then I will give the floor over very, very quickly. Years ago, when I was I recall as a graduate student here at JTS, the question of conversion, what it meant, did it exist, when did it develop, how did it develop, who could convert, all of those many, many questions, and the complexity involved in trying to answer that question, those were central questions in Jewish studies. And as one would expect, the Jewish Theological Seminary, with our body of professors, were engaged in that question at several stages of Jewish history. I remember taking a course with Shaya Cohen, a name that some of you will know, who was working on this material at the time. I noticed, you saw I quickly checked to see, in the bibliography, but there are many, many people who have worked on this, and it is a central and fascinating question. We at the Library of JTS always have something interesting and unexpected to put out on display in connection to virtually any Jewish question you could ask, and this is certainly one of those many questions. The co-curators of this exhibition are Miriam Bodian, who you are about to hear, and Sharon Mintz. Sharon, thank you so much. Sharon and I always have the discussion. I say, Sharon, do you want to say some words of introduction at the beginning? She always says, oh no, you do it, right? So I'm happy to do it again, but as always, we are very grateful to Sharon for, in working with Miriam for creating the exhibition that you've just begun to see. And this is also on the occasion of the new publication of the book Conversion by Miriam Bodian. This is part of the excellent series, the Rutgers series on keywords in Jewish studies. So, if you don't know that series, it's worth getting to know. And it demands of the author that they immerse themselves in what might be a vast field of questions and condense it into a volume that a reader can make sense of if they're interested in the topic at a serious level, but don't want to devote their entire life to it, right? So you want to know everything you need to know about a topic, in this case, conversion, right? Here we are. I also want to thank our conservator, Akiko. Is Akiko here? Akiko, hi. So right back there, Akiko, who is our conservator and makes possible all of these exhibitions, caring for our works and assuring that when we bring them out for all to see, they will be handled in the best way possible. I'll just leave you with a question, and then Miriam will share what she's got with you. If anyone who's been teaching in the Jewish community for even a few years, and certainly more than a few years as I have, will inevitably have run up against the question that goes something like this. I'll be teaching something about conversion to Judaism, and someone will inevitably see, but I thought Jews don't encourage conversion. Right, I see some of you shaking your heads. You've heard that as well. Well, it ain't nearly so simple. The fact is that whether there were converts at all, whether there was conversion at all, and then once conversion developed in the context of the history of Judaism, what the relationship was of different Jewish groups to conversion was not singular. And there were many times that there were a considerable number of converts to Judaism. And it is worth exploring because, of course, whenever you open your arms, whenever you welcome people who were not you to join you, you're saying something significant about what it means to be you, your identity, your group, your experience. And so conversion, the consideration of conversion, is absolutely central to those questions. Miriam.
Thank you, David. I want, first of all, to thank my colleague and mentor in all things exhibition, Sharon Mintz, who first saw the potential for an exhibition in my as yet unfinished book, which I want to show you. It's been a pleasure, and as I said, an education to work with her over the past months to turn the glimmer of an idea into a reality. I also want to thank the various people, who I won't mention by name, who contributed in other ways to mounting this exhibition. And I want to thank all of you for braving this bone-chilling Arctic weather to be here. I was afraid I might be alone at the podium by myself, but I'm glad to see a few faces and many faces that I recognize. I want to first talk about the book and explain why the exhibition is not about what the book is about. In Jewish history, conversion can mean many things. It can mean the act of a person who abandons Judaism for another religion. It can mean the suppression of a Jewish tradition and the imposition of another religion on Jews by force or intimidation. Or it can mean a person's leaving behind a non-Jewish way of life and adopting Judaism. Because this book about conversion appears in the series Keywords in Jewish Studies, it deals with all of these, the whole spectrum of actions that scholars and lay people refer to as acts of conversion. So the book examines the history of socio-religious boundary crossing in both directions into and out of Judaism in its many permutations. Today, though, I want to focus on conversion to Judaism for two reasons. First and foremost, because it's the theme of the exhibition that's opening here today in conjunction with the publication of my book. But there's another reason as well. Conversion to Judaism has been less studied than conversion out, and the contours of its history are less familiar. Why should this be? For one thing, the numbers. Although we lack statistics, it seems evident that over the centuries, at least until fairly recently, the number of converts to Judaism has been far smaller than the number of Jews who've converted to another religion, whether voluntarily or by coercion. This asymmetry isn't surprising, given the realities of Jewish existence for most of the last 2 millennia. These realities are actually alluded to in the key Talmudic passage that lays out the procedure for conversion to Judaism. It instructs the presiding rabbinic judges to warn the potential convert before proceeding, "Don't you know that the Jewish people at the present time are anguished, suppressed, despised, and harassed, and hardships are frequently visited upon them? In other words, do you really want to do this?" Initially, discouraging a candidate for conversion became a practice prescribed by the rabbis, taking as a biblical precedent Naomi's initial efforts in the book of Ruth to discourage Ruth the Moabite from, in effect, becoming a Jew. She relented only when Ruth persisted. A further reason for the imbalance in numbers is intrinsic to Jewish tradition. And here, this is precisely what David just mentioned. Jews held that there was a place in the world to come, not only for conscientious Jews, but for righteous Gentiles as well. So although it's not true that Jews never proselytized, they didn't feel they had to proselytize. That is, they faced no moral obligation to proselytize non-Jews, in contrast to religions whose leaders felt theologically and morally compelled to save infidels from perdition. A further deterrent, no doubt, was to becoming a Jew was the yoke of mitzvot, ol ha-mitzvot, the commitment the convert was expected to make to observe the precepts of Jewish law, all 613 of them according to tradition, which may seem like a lot, but in fact, those 613 commandments were actually only the foundational categories of a far more ramified set of precepts. So for the faint of heart, this surely invited second thoughts about conversion. All of which begs the question, why did non-Jews choose to become Jews? And who were the converts? What lay behind their conversions? So what I want to do here is not to make an original argument or provide a systematic survey, but to present certain major themes and shifts in the history of giyyur, the rabbinic term for conversion to Judaism, themes and shifts that are also represented in the exhibition. I'll stop short of dealing with the modern period, both because our time is short and because the contours of giyyur in modern times are more familiar to most of you than those of pre-modern times. The Hebrew Bible is the obvious first place to start. It's widely believed that the giyyur, who appears in the Hebrew Bible, was a convert, because doesn't the Hebrew word ger mean convert? But actually, in the Bible, ger never means a convert, and the Bible recognizes nothing that resembles conversion. That is, if we mean by that leaving one religious group and joining another out of conviction. Actually, conversion as such didn't exist in the ancient world, where there was no concept of religion as a distinct, compartmentalized category of human existence. The idea that a person could leave his or her ancestral religion and ethnic group for another on religious grounds was unimaginable for Israelites as well as for other peoples. So what was a biblical ger? He or she was a foreigner, someone who belonged to an alien ethnic group but lived among Israelites. It's a bit more complicated than this, but the bottom line is that the biblical ger was never a non-Jew, was always a non-Jew, sorry. English translations of the Bible invariably refer to the ger as a stranger, or in the case of the New Revised Standard Version, resident alien. And here, just some of the major verses, and I want to pay special attention to the third here in Deuteronomy. You too must love the stranger, ger, for you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. So why has ger meant convert for most of history? When the rabbis of the first centuries of the Common Era looked to the Bible for a term that would ground their quite innovative program for the conversion of non-Jews to Judaism, a program that reflected an emerging conceptualization of Jewish belief and practice as a religion, They appropriated the biblical term giyyur. They could do this because of a feature that was common to both the resident alien, the stranger, and the convert. Both lacked family ties that might serve to root them securely in the Jewish community. Both were thus vulnerable and deserving of a compassion that didn't necessarily come naturally to a stranger, toward a stranger. Because of this shared vulnerability, the rabbis were able to view the biblical commandment to love the resident alien, the stranger, as we have here, as in fact a commandment to love the convert. But the rabbis went further than this in drawing from the biblical text, and I want to expand on that a little. They found in certain biblical narratives archetypes of conversion in the sense of an inner transformation of belief and identity. The best known of these is Ruth the Moabite, whom I've already mentioned in the context of Naomi's effort to discourage her from leaving behind the world in which she was raised. Ruth's conversion is encapsulated in her declaration to her Israelite mother-in-law, "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God, Amcha Ami, Eloheich Elohai." And this is the passage with this declaration. Even if a self-initiated declaration like this wasn't anything like rabbinic conversion, the rabbis saw it as an instance of exemplary motivation for conversion. A radical subjective reorientation like that of Ruth was a necessary precondition for undergoing formal conversion to Judaism, at least in theory. But the first and most important convert in rabbinic thinking was the patriarch Abraham. It didn't matter that he lived long before the concepts of Gentile and Jew existed. What mattered was his inner conversion from the idolatrous cult of his ancestors to a strict monotheism. The great medieval scholar Maimonides offered an extended description of Abraham's trajectory as he saw it. Abraham's independent self-conversion began in childhood as the philosophically minded young Abraham gradually came to reject the idolatry around him. As such, Abraham stands out sharply. In fact, he stands alone as a figure who broke with his ethnic and cultic group and, speaking figuratively, of course, became a Jew. Although Abraham was an exemplary figure, his conversion wasn't intended to set an example. His offspring were committed by virtue of their birth to adhere to the covenant God established with Abraham, a covenant God said, quote, "between me and you and your descendants after you throughout the generations." For Abraham's descendants born into the covenant, conversion wasn't a legitimate option, conversion to something else. But could there be conversion to the beliefs of Abraham? Could a non-Israelite become an Israelite? Was the covenant an exclusive one between God and the Jews, or was it open to non-Jews? The answer might seem to be yes, it was open, since in various biblical narratives, Gentile women became, in effect, Jews, and we see that with Ruth. But this was no more than an automatic side effect of their marriage to an Israelite. Such naturalization through marriage followed customary practice in the ancient Near East. In a patriarchal society, the woman was simply expected to adopt the practices of her husband's household. While such marriages to Israelites were sometimes prohibited or viewed unfavorably in the Hebrew Bible, that wasn't always true, and in any case, these marriages were a social reality, a social fact. As for men, it's true that a few foreign biblical men sympathized with the Israelites, but they didn't become Israelites. I'm thinking of Jethro, who sometimes in Midrash regarded as a convert, but he was not, and Naaman, the Aramean commander. They sympathized, but they did not leave their own people or remain with the Jews. Jethro disappears before the revelation at Mount Sinai. The question then remains, could the Hebrew Bible support an idea of conversion given the apparent exclusiveness of the covenant? So here again, rabbinic interpretation played a role in providing biblical support for such a practice. In the midrashic interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, that is a sort of sometimes fanciful commentary on the Bible, Abraham was not only the paradigmatic convert, he was also a proselytizer, getting back to David's comment about expectations, the expectation that Jews never proselytize. Abraham himself was depicted as a proselytizer who brought about the conversion to his monotheistic creed of men and women who were not his offspring. The Midrash suggests this by seizing on a problem in the biblical text. A verse in Genesis tells us that the patriarch Abraham and his wife Sarah journeyed from Haran to Canaan, to Canaan, along with, quote, the souls that they had made in Haran. Because the rabbis were attentive to the meaning of every word, they couldn't ignore the curious phrase, the souls they had made, et hanefesh asher asu. What could this mean if not the people they had converted? Since the verse is in the plural, the persons they had converted, the rabbis explained that Abraham converted the men and Sarah the women, and the terminology they used for what the two of them were doing was rabbinic. Hagerim shegiyyur. The act of making someone a Jew is clearly not related to the act of being a stranger in the biblical sense. The tradition of Abraham's role as a spiritual father to men and women who were not his descendants was perpetuated in a customary practice that's still observed. From the medieval period onward, converts to Judaism have been referred to in religious documents as so-and-so Bat Avraham, daughter of Abraham, or so-and-so Ben Avraham, the son of Abraham. So here we have a marriage contract from London, 1885. This is in the exhibition. And you see here in yellow, Chana bat Avraham Avinu, Chana, the daughter of Abraham, our father. And another example, this is a marriage contract, a ketubah, from Moravia in 1843. The bride's name is Chaya bat Avraham Avinu, in here. It's not that legible, but that's what it says. And there are, of course, many, many other examples. My point is this. Although there's nothing in Israelite history that resembles the rabbinic practice of conversion, still, the Hebrew Bible, Judaism's foundational text, provided important grounding for the rabbinic elaboration of giyyur. The conceptual transformation of the term ger is only one example of how more broadly the rabbis sought to create a unitary tradition out of the diverse sacred texts they scrutinized. But the question remains, if not in biblical times, when did a concept of conversion as a religiously motivated, distinct, ritualized act emerge in the Jewish world? The Talmud offers the first elaboration of such a process. But there's evidence that giyyurim, in the sense of converts, first appeared somewhat earlier in the late Second Temple period, that is, from the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. We have as evidence funerary inscriptions as well as passages in works by well-known authors, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Philo and Josephus, Jewish authors, Tacitus, Juvenal, Roman authors. In the inscriptions, the Hebrew term ger and the Greek term proselyte were used synonymously to refer to non-Jews who underwent conversion to Judaism. This is an ossuary. There was a practice for a short period of time of secondary burial of bones in a limestone box, basically. And you see the inscription here, and it's a little bit clearer in this close-up that has been given the aid of color. Yochanan ben Hager Zol. Yochanan, the son of the convert Zol. We know from the written sources that male converts in this pre-rabbinic period underwent circumcision, just as Abraham and members of his household did when they entered the covenant, and all converts, male and female, made a commitment to observe the commandments. The number of Gerim in this period was apparently significant. But why did Roman pagans in this period want to be Jews? Scholars have speculated that the prophetic and wisdom texts of the Jews, Isaiah and Amos, prophetic, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, wisdom texts, these texts that emphasize values of justice and righteousness without abandoning specifically Jewish themes, these may have struck a chord with educated pagans who would have had access to the Hebrew Bible through the Greek translation known as the Septuagint. This is just a fragment of the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible. Other scholars have pointed to the fact that in this period of upheaval, there were many Romans who felt alienated from the impersonal forms of late antique pagan worship. Such people may have been attracted to the intimate relationship to the sacred in Jewish life. But the bottom line is that the motivations of these converts are a matter of speculation. It was the early rabbinic corpus that radically transformed the way giyyur would be practiced and understood over the centuries, particularly the Babylonian Bible, which is what we mean by the Talmud. This doesn't mean that the rabbinic procedure for conversion immediately became normative. The Talmud was compiled around the 6th century, but it would take several more centuries before it gained undisputed authority in the Jewish world. So I'll strip down to its essentials the procedure the rabbis of the Talmud laid out. The potential convert was to come before a Beit Din, a rabbinic court, of his or her own initiative, and the court would examine his or her motivations. Theoretically, the only valid motivation for giyyur was a religious one, in rabbinic terms, for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. A non-Jew seeking conversion for any other reason would be turned away. Once past this screening, the potential convert would be given some instruction in Jewish law. The rabbi stipulated that it shouldn't be too onerous. After learning the basics and accepting the commandments, the male converts would be circumcised, and finally both male and female converts would be immersed in a ritual bath. They would emerge, so the Talmud put it, quote, like an Israelite in every respect, ke'Israel lechol davar. In some passages, the Talmud offers a quite positive, even poetic view of the Gael, that is, the Gael Tzedek, the sincere convert. Borrowing from a verse in the book of Ruth, the Gael is described as having, quote, taken shelter under the wings of the divine presence, an expression that gained wide currency as a reference to conversion. But the very term sincere convert hints that there were other kinds of converts, and attitudes to converts weren't always enthusiastic. Given human nature, it's not surprising that converts were sometimes disparaged or slighted by other Jews. It was presumably in response to actual insults that a passage appears in the early rabbinic corpus that prohibits Jews from reminding converts of their origins or otherwise insulting them. The example this text gives of such an insult is pretty vivid. You should not say to the Gael, quote, last night you were worshiping idols and had pork between your teeth, and you dare to speak words against me? We know a lot about what the Talmudic rabbis had to say about conversion, but what do we know about actual converts in their period? The answer to that question is almost nothing. Only a handful of converts are mentioned in rabbinic texts of the early centuries CE, either in Palestine or Babylonia. Was this because in this period, after the destruction of the Second Temple and the crushing defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jewish life had little appeal for non-Jews? Is it because the rabbis had quite limited authority and influence in this period, as some scholars have maintained, so that conversions by a rabbinic court would have been rare? Had a demoralized Jewish population in Roman Palestine essentially accommodated to Roman domination, becoming paganized or semi-paganized? We don't know. But why, if conversion was so rare, did the rabbis engage in such detailed discussion of it? This isn't really a question for anybody familiar with the Talmud. It was for the same reason that the rabbis engaged in detailed debates, for example, about priestly duties that were no longer relevant, given that the temple where they carried out their duties lay in ruins. And that's only one example. The rabbis developed the laws of giyyur in detail because envisioning and institutionalizing a process of conversion was an integral part of their broader project of elucidating every element of the written and oral tradition they had inherited. It's in the medieval period from the 9th to 15th centuries that we first encounter flesh and blood converts. These men and women inhabited a religious environment that stood in sharp contrast to the culturally open world of late antiquity. Virtually all Jews in this period lived under either Christianity or Islam, religions with exclusive claims to the truth and unfavorable attitudes to infidels. Living under Christianity was particularly problematic for Jews because Christian doctrine drew so deeply from the Old Testament, and because the Jews who possessed that text in the original Hebrew rejected Christian interpretation of key verses. But whether they were living under Christian or Muslim rule, Jews were subjected to discrimination, special taxation, hostility, at times violence. Even if a person overcame the psychological and practical obstacles to giyyur under these conditions, they faced mortal danger, since conversion to Judaism was a crime punishable by death, at least in theory. Yet such conversions did occasionally take place. Before I turn to the mostly men who took these risks, let me just mention that the most common form of giyyur in the medieval period was almost certainly that of freed slaves. Domestic slavery was a fact of life in the wealthy urban centers of the Muslim world, and in this respect, as in others, Jews were no different from their Muslim neighbors. When slaves were bought by Jews, they underwent partial conversion, presumably without any realistic possibility of objecting to that process. If and when such slaves were freed, often by a mistress on her deathbed, they underwent full conversion almost as a matter of course, and their bills of manumission were in fact certificates of giyyur, certificates of conversion. This is a Geniza document that, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, that shows, it's known as a get shi'ur, that served as a certificate of giyyur. This is from 12th century Egypt. Although the conversions of freed slaves were no different in essence than other conversions, they bore little resemblance to the Talmudic model of conversion, in which a non-Jew came before rabbinic judges to initiate a voluntary process. So although this is an important episode, and one that we know quite a lot about because of the Cairo Geniza, and one that people don't know about, I'm not going to discuss it here, but I invite you to learn about it both in the exhibition and in my book. And I just want to explain, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Cairo Geniza, this was an absolutely spectacular trove of medieval documents that had been produced by Jews under Islamic rule, about 400,000 manuscripts and fragments of manuscripts that was discovered in late 19th century in a Cairo synagogue and has given us a very full picture of Jewish life under Islam between the 11th and 13th centuries, and with some documents both before and after those dates. So let's turn to those medieval non-Jews who freely chose to convert to Judaism. The modern response to such conversions might be one that I've heard from students. Why would anyone do that, given the conditions of life faced by medieval Jews and the risks involved in giyyur? On the basis of what we know about medieval converts, I just make the point that it's hard for us to understand the medieval mindset. And not that there's one mindset, I understand, but medieval religiosity. It's hard for us to understand minds that were tormented by the existential religious doubts and apocalyptic expectations that we know about, particularly anxiety about salvation, but also feverish anticipation of the end of days. And I have to admit, when I wrote this sentence, I realized that we have plenty of anxiety about the end of days. I just say that if a devout person's eternal fate was felt to hinge on adopting and cleaving to the true faith, their worries and their choices would differ from ours. From their perspective, our way of seeing things would no doubt seem myopic in the extreme. Let me start with the Islamic orbit. Scholars once believed that because Islam prohibited anyone under its rule to convert to any religion, except Islam, the converts to Judaism who are mentioned in the Cairo Geniza, that is, whose names appear in records produced in Islamic lands, must have been Christians who converted to Judaism in Christian lands before fleeing to Muslim ones. And that was usually the case. But there were exceptions. We know of the existence of some converts in Islamic lands simply because they're mentioned as so-and-so the giyyur in lists of people who received charity from the Jewish community. Converts sometimes received a letter of recommendation from communal authorities to help them solicit material help. And this is another Geniza document. It's displayed in the exhibition. It's a fragment of such a letter of recommendation in Judeo-Arabic, which is written, as you can see, in Hebrew letters. Converts sometimes also petitioned wealthy members of the community on their own, describing their plight. One impoverished convert portrayed himself with great pathos as, quote, the proselyte, your servant Mordechai, the young, the low, the destitute, the immigrant, the poor, the desolate, the bitter, exiled from my place, detached from my land like a bird wandering from her nest. I'm almost crying. Unfortunately, as in other cases, Mordechai's petition offers no insight into what led him to convert. I should add that while converts who uprooted themselves were often in need of charity because they'd lost their homes and their sources of income, not all were poor. One highly successful convert, Abu al-Khair, became a member of the Jewish elite of Cairo in the late 11th century, and in fact was among those who gave charity. Probably the best known of all medieval converts to Judaism was originally, scholars believe, a Muslim. This was Ovadia the giyyur, who is best known for an inquiry he sent to Maimonides, the foremost intellectual figure of medieval Judaism. This is in the exhibit, a 15th century copy of the Maimonides' very well-known 12th century letter to Ovadia the giyyur. Ovadia asked whether he was prohibited, as he had presumably been told he was, from using phrases like God of our fathers when reciting prayers, given that his fathers didn't worship the God Jews worshipped. This was on the face of it a halachic question, a question of Jewish law, and not a new one. But its subtext raised questions about the very being of the convert. Was a giyyur truly and entirely a Jew? Could a convert be recognized as such if he was differentiated from other Jews every time he prayed? In his unusually passionate response, he was not a passionate person. Maimonides drew on the biblical tradition I've mentioned, according to which converts were in the category of members of his household whom Abraham converted. As disciples of Abraham, they were not only permitted, but required to recite God of our fathers. You who brought us out from the land of Egypt, you who performed miracles for our ancestors, and so on, like any other Jew. Maimonides' letter is known as much for his compassionate tone, aimed at easing a convert's underlying distress, as it is for the ruling itself. And I'll just read one passage. Since you, Ovadia, have come under the wings of the divine presence, that phrase, no difference exists between you and us, and no difference between you and us, and all miracles done to us have been done, as it were, to us and to you. Know that our fathers, when they came out of Egypt, were mostly idolaters. They mingled with the pagans of Egypt and imitated their way of life until the Holy One, blessed be He, sent Moses, our teacher, who brought us under the wings of the divine presence, us and all proselytes, and gave to all of us one law. This passage is remarkable in the way it minimizes the significance of Jewish biological ancestry and generalizes the act of giyyur, seeing it as a kind of reenactment of the origin story of the Jewish people. However contemptible the act of giyyur may have been to Muslims, it was a great deal more scandalous to Christians, for whom Jewish beliefs were anathema. Yet while some converts from Christianity fled to Muslim lands either after they converted or in order to convert, some remained in Christian lands after conversion, perhaps escaping detection by changing residence. In the later medieval period, as the church became increasingly militant, punishment for a Christian who underwent giyyur could be violent, as in the 13th century case of a former cleric in England who was hanged for his betrayal. It wasn't only the converts themselves who were endangered by the step they took. The church punished Jews who were in any way involved in the conversion of a Christian. In 13th century Toulouse, a rabbi was burned to death by the Papal Inquisition on a charge of proselytizing, and there were other such incidents. Under the circumstances, it isn't surprising that only about 80 cases of giyyur have been identified in Christian Europe for the period from the 11th to 14th centuries. What's noteworthy in these conversions is the heightened meaning they took on for contemporaries in the context of the church's aggressive missionizing of the Jews. This is an image just sort of compressing into a single image what was going on in the struggle between church and Jews in the medieval period, with a scene of Saint Stephen, regarded as the first martyr of the church, preaching to Jews, some of whom are showing their obvious resistance, others preaching to Saint Stephen, and still others tearing up some written document, which would probably be, given the circumstances, the period, the time, probably, it can't, of course, be the Bible. It must be, I think, the Talmud, which came under increasing attack in the late medieval period. So it's in this very polemical struggle, in the midst of this polemical struggle, that, strangely enough, brought to the attention of some Christians arguments that they couldn't really respond to. The text of the Hebrew Bible raised questions that were difficult to answer in terms of the simple sense of the text. And so it's no accident that so many medieval Christian converts to Judaism were clerics and or nobles, and that a number of them were active after their conversion as defenders of Judaism and as anti-Christian polemicists. The earliest such case on record, which is known only through Latin sources, was that of a 9th century deacon and assistant to a bishop named Bodo in the court of the Frankish king Louis the Pious. A chronicler describes him as a member of an important Frankish family who had received a, quote, courtly education, so he could read the Latin Vulgate Bible, and he perhaps found it difficult to understand certain key passages according to Christian interpretation. In the year 838, he sought permission from the emperor to go to Rome, but once in Rome, or possibly after he left Rome, he converted to Judaism. The chronicler tells us that, quote, once circumcised, he let the hair of his head and beard grow long and called himself Eliezer. He settled in Saragossa, Spain, which was then under Muslim rule, and where he studied Torah and engaged in a literary debate in Cordova with a Jewish convert to Christianity. Unfortunately, Bodo's arguments were torn from the single existing manuscript record of the debate, presumably to prevent their dissemination. More than a century later, another convert named Ovadia, this one an educated Italian nobleman and Catholic priest, originally named Johannes, converted and embarked on a life of wandering in Muslim lands. A letter of recommendation written on his behalf by a rabbi in Aleppo years after his conversion described him as, quote, expert in the study of their, that is, the Christians' books, who, because he understood what he read in the books of their false doctrines, decided to turn to the God of Israel and officially embrace Judaism before a Jewish court. In an autobiographical account in Hebrew, Ovadia related that when he was a child in southern Italy, the conversion to Judaism in Constantinople of an Italian archbishop named Andreas made a strong impression on him. He was also inspired by the enduring memory of an apocalyptic dream in his youth, one that featured a prophetic verse from the book of Joel. His conversion to Judaism was initially a self-conversion, which he undertook while still living among Christians. He performed circumcision on himself, as he reported Andreas had also done, and observed the holidays of God as they are written in the Torah, as well as Sabbath. It's an interesting fact, if not entirely relevant to this talk, that Ovadia also produced the earliest surviving notation of Hebrew liturgical music using a system of notation that predated the musical notation we use today. And this is an example of his musical notations. This was actually displayed in the Grolier exhibit, which some of you have seen, not in the exhibition here today. The timing of Ovadia's conversion and his preoccupation with the verse from Joel has led to speculation that he was swayed to take this radical step by apocalyptic expectations that were widespread around the time of the First Crusade. Beliefs like these may explain the extreme behavior of other such converts. One educated 11th century convert, for example, related in a letter written in awkward Hebrew that as a monk or cleric, he had circumcised himself and begun to observe Jewish precepts. Driven to recklessness by religious fervor, he drew up 14 polemical treatises against Christianity and asked to have them read publicly. He was imprisoned, but miraculously escaped with the help of a guard. Similarly, a 13th century Christian convert to Judaism from Augsburg provoked his former fellow Christians by desecrating crucifixes or images of saints. He was tortured and burned at the stake. And in a list of Jews killed in Wissembourg some years later, one convert was described as the head of all those who go barefoot, that is, Franciscans, who abhorred images and took shelter under the wings of the divine presence and was burned as a martyr. Such dramatic actions recall the behavior of Jews whose impassioned acts of resistance during the Crusades were glorified in martyrological accounts. So the picture changes dramatically in the early modern period. And this is a bit briefer. I hope I still have a bit of time. This period saw the breakup of a monolithic Western church and the emergence of diverse forms of Christianity, as well as bloody religious wars that led to the accommodation of some European societies to a multi-religious environment. All of these had an impact on the nature and frequency of the conversion of Christians to Judaism. As in the medieval period, the best documented converts to Judaism in Reformation Europe were educated men driven by doubts about basic Christian doctrines. But they differed from their medieval predecessors. Their thinking tended to reflect a new sensibility with elements of anti-clericalism, that is, opposition to institutionalized religious authority of any kind, tolerationism, and skeptical thinking. Among other things, this was the heyday of Christian Hebraism. Christian Hebraists, Christian scholars of Hebrew, were exploring Jewish texts with new curiosity, taking special interest in Jewish customs that had long been regarded as simply proof that Judaism was a dead or carnal religion. At a time when European expansion stimulated interest in exotic human customs, some European Christians developed a more open-minded approach to the way Jews lived. The many works about Jewish customs produced by Christian Hebraists in this period, among them Johannes Buxdorf's massive Synagoga Judaica from 1603, made the everyday rituals of Jewish life accessible to Christians. And here you have a chapter devoted to the holiday of Sukkot and an image of a sukkah, one of the huts that is built during the holiday of Sukkot. Jews and Christians also mingled with one another in the Hebrew print industry, and this intimacy of Christians and Jews and Jewish texts led to the conversion to Judaism of some of the Christian printers, although, of course, it also led to the baptism of some Jews. To give but one example, the etchings illustrating the famous 1695 edition of the Amsterdam Haggadah were produced by Avram Bar Yaakov, a former pastor and convert to Judaism. You can see here his name on the title page, Avram Bar Yaakov, from the family, Mimishpachat Avraham Avinu, from the family of Avraham Avinu. Among Christian nonconformists and religious seekers, a more open religious outlook led to a questioning of religious loyalties that, in a religiously fragmented environment, struck some as beliefs that were acquired as a mere accident of birth and not by rational inquiry. Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Zwinglians, Anabaptists, not to mention anti-Trinitarians, who was to say which possessed the one true faith. In the 1680s, the Austrian theologian Johann Peter Speth asked, quote, whether there might not be a touchstone or sign by which one could know who has the correct truth and knowledge, since so many all over the world differ from each other. After a long spiritual odyssey, Speth converted to Judaism in Amsterdam and became known as Moses Germanus. Part of the appeal to him of Judaism, which he understood in quite unconventional terms, was its basic fixity in a world of spiritual flux and instability. A tradition as enduring as Judaism must, he felt, harbor a primordial kernel of truth. The young Frenchman Aaron Danton followed a somewhat similar path when he underwent giyyur in Amsterdam around 1701. Like medieval converts to Christianity who found themselves rejecting one theological orthodoxy, unlike medieval converts from Christianity who found themselves rejecting one theological orthodoxy for another, these intellectually unconventional men were looking for a tradition that would anchor their own unorthodox views. Okay, I'm going to honor now my promise and stop here at the threshold of the modern period when things get really complicated, when some of the most basic givens in the classic practice and understanding of giyyur have been challenged, at least in some quarters. Here is the website converttojudaism.online, which claims to be, quote, the most affordable online Jewish learning and conversion program on the web, and promises that your conversion will be as easy as 1, 2, 3. It caters to an American audience for whom religion has become increasingly individualized, self-oriented, and commodified. But as I said, this is only one recent example. There are many issues in the modern period. You're invited to visit the exhibition for a presentation of some modern developments in Europe and the United States in the pre-World War II period. I also invite you to read the book, which deals with modern issues in a more expansive way. It pays particular attention to the post-war era with its many novel issues, some of them particular to the state of Israel, some of them particular to the diaspora. But now, if we have a little bit of time, I'd like to open the floor to questions. Yes, Daniel? I'm sorry, can you speak up a little?
Sorry, I'll speak up. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, so the Muslim talked about how in the Muslim orbit there was a general prohibition on converting any religion aside from Islam, so there were a few exceptions. But you also talked about the case of slaves, who generally have some conversion when they were purchased and then got this star when they were. So was that just an area where there was a general exception to the rule that was acknowledged? Are there discussions about that on the side of Islamic theologians?
It's a very good question, which unfortunately I can't entirely answer.
Let's stay by the microphone so that people who are...
I think it is an exceptional. I don't know what the arrangement was, because slaves were very common, domestic slaves were very common, and the Islamic authorities certainly acquiesced when they were semi-converted at the time of their purchase. So my guess is that once semi-converted, they were then allowed to be fully converted, but I can't answer the question. I do not know the answer.
Hi, thank you again for the talk. My question correlates to modern day. I know in like the early 2000s or something along the lines, there was a big flux in Kabbalistic. Like a lot of famous people were converting more or less to Kabbalah and the doctrine of that regards. What do you feel, like how do you feel about that? Or in the eyes of conversion, like what, I don't know if that even makes sense.
Well, how I feel about it doesn't really matter. I mean, it reflects a trend that's definitely a modern, recent trend in which spiritual matters tend to be self-oriented and individual, as you see on the website. It's simply a trend, and it doesn't really, I think that it's, the one thing I can say is that it has not yet shown its staying power because it's completely uninstitutionalized. It doesn't, the Madonna's, for example, Madonna's Kabbalistic Center, the Kabbalah Center, lies completely outside the world of organized Jewish religion. The conversions are not, they're conversions to that particular group of Jews, and in a sense, that's typical of American conversions, you convert within a certain community. And these new kinds of communities, which are not recognized by mainstream Jewish groups, do what they do. And of course, people are quite free to practice as they like in those communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're welcome to go into the gallery now and spend some time looking at both some of the items that you saw on screen and others. I'm sure Miriam would be happy to take questions informally. Inside, there's still some food out, so please feel free to take advantage of that. And most importantly, I think, for those of you who are interested in pursuing this topic further, there are flyers as you exit, they should be, which describe the book and include a discount code if you want to order the book from the publisher. We will also distribute an electronic version of that so that if you don't get a flyer, you will nevertheless be able to pick up a copy of the book. Thank you very much for coming.